Good morning, everyone. Last class. How many more days of class are there? 0? This is like, for whom is this the last class? All right. Well, yeah. I guess it's good luck, but yeah, good times. But now with the new schedule, it's like now finals happen. Okay, so this is the last lecture in ENV200. And the idea is to just provide a recap, but also to give you some instructions about what the final is going to be like, and again, what the grading is going to be like, and to give you the opportunity also to ask questions depending on how fast we go. Now, I've got a long slide here, which are final. It contains final exam instructions, and more than half the class had actually trouble using Gradescope, and stuff was downloaded wrong, and all kinds of stuff. I kind of missed all of that because Christina, my assistant, and the other people in the course kind of handled what was going on. But this time there are explicit instructions, so only enter Gradescope at 7 p.m. on December 15th. Whoa. Please do not enter early, especially to download or print the PDF. Physically print the exam, write in your answers, and scan all original pages as a new PDF, okay? The final PDF needs to be in the same format with the same number of pages as the original. Oh my gosh. Upload this into Gradescope, and if the format is correct, it will accept the file and you are finished. Alternatively, it's possible to download the PDF rather than print it and fill in the answers using a PDF editor, but you should only do this if you've got a PDF editor, like, what, Acrobat Pro? Yeah, right? And if you have the software to do so, right? Save the PDF in the original format with the original page numbers, including blank pages, and choose the physical method you'd like to write out your answers for math questions. Scrap pages are not accepted by Gradescope. Follow the above procedure for the separate lecture and precept exams. Enter Gradescope through the lecture or precept Canvas site for the respective exam. Okay, now I'll come around to this and just, yes, go ahead. Yeah, I was just going to get to that. I'm going to look to see what has been included in the instructions about when you have to do the exam, and we will change it on the fly if we don't like what we see. Okay? All right. So the environmental nexus is unlike other courses in that it the design criterion, and always with mixed success, is to arm you with enough information by continuing to, sort of keep up with current events, to be able to vote intelligently to make your own choices about these 4 intersecting global environmental problems. And to some extent, we're trying to teach you how to think, but that's really a secondary objective, whereas it's the primary objective in most courses, right? And so, to some extent, we want to teach you how other people think, right? So if you look at this from an ethical perspective, or if an economist looks at these problems, what does she see? But the idea is just to make you familiar enough with this material so that you can make your own choices in an intelligent way rather than the way a lot of people make it, based on the way they feel, right? So the problems are the climate problem, which by now you know quite a bit about, and which your generation really does seem to pay a lot of attention to. The food problem, which we know some about from this course, but your generation pays a lot of attention to. The water problem, which you probably only pay attention to if you come from a place where it's a problem, right? So Californians pay attention, New Jerseyites don't. And the biodiversity problem, which you probably pay attention to only if you're one of those people that really, for whom this is resonates somehow emotionally, usually, all right? So the final exam is a take-home on December 7th, on December 15th, from 7 to 10 p.m. I think we should give them more time. Rob, what do you think? Simone? Right? I think we should give them more time. To what? Well, what would you guys like? Would you like 7 to midnight, 6 to 11? What do you want? Start earlier. 5 or 6? Over dinner? You get hungry. What do you want? Let's vote for 5. Vote for 6. Okay, 6 wins. And 6 to 11? All right? And you're not supposed to take 5. If you take 5 hours, you're like wasting your time, okay? You really are. This exam will not take 5 hours. This exam is designed to take under 3 hours. So if you write for 5 hours, you really need to start thinking about the priorities in your life, okay? That's the message, okay? Don't take school so seriously, all right? Do other things, anything, like, watch YouTube videos or something, I don't know. All right, so that's what it's going to be. It's going to be 6 to 11 on the 15th, all right? So all that stuff on the previous slide where it said don't enter before 7, that's now wrong, okay? So when you look back, it's 6 o'clock on the 15th. All right, the final determines 30% of your grade. So 2/3 of it is focused on the second half of the course. Why is that? Because the midterm determines 20% of your grade and is 1/3 and the exam is 1/3 cumulative. All right. So the point is that the majority of the final is on the second half of the course, because you can think of it as it's a midterm for 20% plus, right? Some of the cumulative stuff will integrate, right? So if you're going to prioritize your studying, prioritize the second half of the course more than the first half, but obviously look over the first half. And in particular, if you miss some stuff on the first exam, make sure you're up to speed on the way you would have wanted to answer those questions, because it's not uncommon to revisit, to give people a chance, right, like that. So it's the same format as the other exam. As before, 2/3 to 3/4 of the questions are common to all 6 sections and cover material from the Monday, Wednesday, Friday classes and associated readings. The remaining 1/4 to 1/3 of the questions are specific to your section. All right? So that's the way this works. So when this is all done, what we're going to do is convert your midterm score, your precept score, your final score, and your participation, such as it is. I mean, it's been disrupted by COVID. I mean, participation is really difficult to judge when half the people are, in quarantine or whatever. But in any case, we'll convert it all to like a 100-point scale, right? And everybody will have a number. And we'll look at the distribution, and we'll look at the distribution by precept also, to make sure that some precepts didn't grade a lot harder than others, that sort of thing. And we'll make adjustments. Generally, it hasn't been necessary to do that, in 5 times of teaching this thing. But if we did have a really hard precept, then they'd get goosed up a bit in their grade, right? To make the means approximately the same, all right? And that's the way it'll be, right? So that and on one hand, there's a fair amount writing on the final. On the other hand, it's 30%. And so, and also when it comes to grading, we're not out to hurt you, all right? So yeah, well, you get the idea. Any questions on that? Yeah. The review day is Monday, December 13th from 7 to 8:30 here, all right? So we'll be here to answer your questions. And it's the same format as before. We'll sit there and wait for you to ask a question. Nobody asks a question, nobody will say anything, okay? And if you ask questions, we'll answer them, all right? Will we record that? Great idea, I suppose. Yeah, let's record it, all right? And that way, if you have a conflict or you're in quarantine or whatever, people can't zoom in, but they can record it? What would you rather, be able to zoom in or have it recorded if there's a choice? The audiovisual system in this room is twitchy in that way. Which of those two would you prefer? Who would prefer to be able to zoom in and not see the recording? Who would prefer to see the recording and not zoom in? That one wins, okay? So we'll set it up if we can, but if we can't, we won't have the Zoom available, all right? And your preceptor will also be holding a review section for the material restricted to your precept, but you have to check the Blackboard site for the date and time of that, all right? And when I say, when this is called a review, it's not really a review. You get to ask questions, is what it is. Okay, so I want to just do a little bit of a recap on science and technology that's available to confront the Nexus problem. And here, as opposed to on the political side of things, or in the way in which we manage and sustain human conviction and empathy, right, on ethical consistency, on all the other parts of it. Here, on the science and technology side, we're in really pretty good shape, or you are. I'll be dead, right? But you're in pretty good shape. The consequences of business as usual aren't good, all right? Tens of millions of human deaths, mass extinctions, and hundreds of trillions in costs, all right? That's what sort of sober estimates come up with during sort of the course of the century. It's a lot of trouble. And we don't even know all the, again, I said at the beginning of the course, usually when you see an environmental expert, they're a little less concerned than the most fraught members of the public. And here, there are members of the public who actually believe the sky is falling right now, whereas it's hard to point to strong scientific evidence that that's the case. But if you find someone who's a climate scientist who knows the underpinnings of the way the climate system works, like a person who works under the hood of a climate model, they're way more worried than you are, I guarantee it, all right? Because the system is twitchy. I was just talking to one of the students, Terrence Tao, the guy who's a Princeton PhD, who's known as the Mozart of mathematics. He won the Millennium Prize for showing that the Navier-Stokes equations have solutions that blow up in finite time. Now, given that the Navier-Stokes equations govern the climate, that's not good, okay? That's potentially not a good thing. All right, anyway, so scientifically sound solutions, though, are still open to humanity. We stop climate change at 1.5 degrees. As far as we know, we're far away from tipping points. If we stop the expansion of agricultural land, by increased crop yields through fertilizer, reduced food waste, and modest diet shifts, especially away from beef. If we price water in places where irrigated agriculture is the problem, which is almost everywhere that water is scarce, and if we promote trade in food, which effectively trades irrigation water, then we really do limit the damage, all right? Solves all 4 Nexus problems. They're available and they're cost competitive. Additional damages would still be inevitable, even with the greenest feasible solution, including something like 10% of species lost. But even there, 10% of species lost presupposes that our agricultural land will never contract in the future, and I can't predict what's going to happen 3 centuries from now to humanity. And I don't think anybody else can either. And so if the agricultural land subsequently contracts, we're not going to lose 10% of the species because it takes millennia for the number of species to get into alignment with the amount of land area, right? There are still millions and trillions in dollars in damages from the effects of climate change, because there are now, all right? But it's a lot better than hundreds of trillions. And because damage is a concave up function, an accelerating function of cumulative emissions, every point at which we stop averts yet worse damages than we've seen so far. So there is never a point of too late, sort of paradoxically, and it's a, it's a bizarre way to think about it, but because this problem is so serious and accelerating, every place you stop, you've averted worse damages. It's never too late, right? Again, the tipping points that we know about, like these on the slide, occur far from the 1.5 to 2 degrees goal. And deglaciation and the loss of coastal cities is the only one that's a bit closer, but that one even takes millennia. And I don't know where we're going to be technologically in millennia. There's recent evidence that a small ice sheet we haven't talked about in Antarctica may be destabilized. And that's like real recent. And if it's the case, we could, but the good news is it's not a big one, and so it's big enough to raise seas by 1 meter this century, which would be bad, but not enough to destroy all our coastal cities. It would require massive public works. So we're sort of playing with trouble. But as far as we know, the sort of existential catastrophes are quite a ways away if we can get our act together and stop now. Again, there's quite a bit of evidence that climate change is currently killing lots of people and costing lots and lots of money. Kofi Annan, who was the 7th Secretary General of the UN, has an estimate. I don't know how Kofi Annan gets this estimate, but there are lots of estimates out there now, and the numbers are big. I mean, they're eye-poppingly big. We looked at Solomon Shang's work, and the damages we see may be the tip of the iceberg, because they don't include any of the effects that he and others now have uncovered of the relationship between climate changes, extreme weather, and violence, among other things. Again, the solution is to stop atmospheric CO2 growth by mid-century, all right? A little less than 30 years from now, almost 28 now. And that is a tall order, but it's not crazy tall. And also, if you miss by a little bit, you can come out of the COP26 and think, oh, we failed. Or you can look at the commitments that nations have made and say they've fallen short, but they would, if the nations met them, they'd be at about 2.5 degrees. And that's down a lot, okay? Next time around, my guess is it'll be 2 degrees or less, right? So at least the commitments that countries make are getting into the right position. And some countries are, in fact, investing at the scale that they need to. Because the technological endgame, as I've made the case repeatedly, has all of a sudden become affordable. It's now in hand. We have, at least for the climate problem, for an all-electric economy fueled by solar, wind, hydro, nuclear, and gas, with carbon capture and storage, some combination of those, right? And the cost is about what we pay for energy today, all right? About the same. So you have electric light, heat, and cooling, electric cars and trucks, and aviation, and a couple of other technologies, perhaps running on biofuel or with offsets or something with direct air capture. But that's sort of 3% currently. It's not, it's not a big term. So we have the end game to solve the climate problem. We've long had the end game to solve the food problem, and with meat substitutes, all of a sudden, finally, we may be able to do significant diet shifts, which really changes that for the better. And so that's climate and food. Both have had revolutions. We've long had the capacity to use water. Water is the resource that we've probably used most profligately as a species. And so all we have to do is stop being crazy when it comes to water. And then sort of biodiversity takes care of itself if you can learn to live, if we can figure out how to live on the land we've already settled, right? That's the idea here. It's not crazy. But it really is because of recent technological revolution, which is due simply to human ingenuity. and I think this is going to continue. I think this problem will fall to human ingenuity, and the only question is how fast and how many damages do we then get to avert. So again, the food problem is that if we expanded cropland to meet the growth of demand, it would have to come primarily from tropical forest, and this then blows up the climate problem because all those trees are made of carbon and turn into carbon dioxide and push us past 2 degrees just there. And it also causes a mass extinction. So that's bad, so we shouldn't do that, and we don't have to. The biodiversity problem, again, if we limit the farmland and you look at the species area relationship, which is still probably the most believable way to do this, you're at 11% of the species, but again, that takes centuries, and we have time to learn how to do even better and maybe avert most of that also. And for the water problem, the 50% growth in demand means that we're going to have to do more to finally start treating water as a precious resource and deal with it in ways that we've long known how to do. But if we do, we can live on the water we've got on the planet. We actually have way more water than we need. It's just a distributional concern, which is like saying, it's just that people are living in a place with no water, okay? I said just is the wrong thing to say. But the point is that we know how to move food around, we know how to price water and make it used more efficiently for agriculture and so on. So it doesn't mean that it's not an important problem, it's just a problem we know how to solve. So science is now able, with reasonable accuracy, to predict the consequences of business as usual and the effectiveness of alternative mitigation strategies. And the required technology looks increasingly adequate. So the real impediments are economic, political, ethical, and imaginative. And effective global management over the next century will require sustained empathy for people who are distant in time, space, and culture from you. All right, and so now I want to turn it over to Sarah.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay.
Shall I make you bigger?
I see it fine. I'm not sure how it looks for you, but I see it fine.
Okay, I'm making them see you fine. All right, go ahead.
Social analysis portion of the class, we covered social, economic, and political frameworks that are frequently used in discussions about Nexus challenges and responses to these challenges. So we started with the differences between free markets and planned economies. In theory, decentralized free market economies achieve an efficient allocation of scarce resources. But efficiency doesn't mean that inequality is minimized or that the environment is protected. The problems of climate change, biodiversity loss, water scarcity, and land use all have components of collective action problems or social dilemmas. These are situations where individual interests are at odds with collective interests and are often associated with market failures. So examples that we discussed in class are externalities, which are created when goods and services don't reflect social and environmental costs in their prices, the maintenance of the commons, and intergenerational trade-off. In the context of the Nexus, these challenges are particularly salient because those responsible for damages are often not the same people experiencing the repercussions, and those who can pay the costs to avoid current and future damages are not always the ones who will benefit. To prevent the overuse or misuse of natural resources, ensure that wealth doesn't remain concentrated in the hands of a few, and to protect the livelihoods and interests of future generations, we need institutions that facilitate cooperation from policy and government to social norms. Next slide, please. Yeah, perfect. So economic tools allow us to weigh the costs and benefits of policies or actions to evaluate how desirable they are. And this requires assigning a monetary value to goods that don't always have a market price, for example, saving a human life or avoiding the extinction of a species. There are also empirical and normative reasons to think that all dollars are not equal in these comparisons. Utility functions are generally concave, which means a dollar is worth more when you have no money than when you have a lot, and by extension, a dollar is worth more to a poor person than to a wealthy person. There are also empirical and normative rationales for how to value or discount future consumption relative to the present, and how we set the discount rate has huge implications for policy. Social welfare functions can be used to incorporate curvature and discounting in the comparison of consumption streams over time and across generations, and to select the one with the highest present value. There are many different policy instruments that can be used to address environmental and social challenges, including public investment in public goods, like research and development to negative emissions technologies, regulation or command and control approaches, economic incentives or market-based approaches, like carbon taxes, where the price of carbon is increased to account for its social cost, or subsidies on renewables, and softer but important measures like education, which can promote behavior change. Compensatory policies like tax and dividends, where earnings from a carbon tax are redistributed to compensate for the regressivity of the tax, can also increase its popularity and address the relationship between environmental damage and other forms of inequity. And recent policy frameworks like the Green New Deal highlight the importance of considering social and environmental outcomes together in order to build broader coalitions. Next, please. Okay. Assessing policies by their social and political acceptance is important, especially when issues are politicized and divisive. Public opinion studies show that the US can be divided into 6 distinct interpretive communities that vary in their level of concern and narratives about climate change and the environment. And these interpretive lenses extend to the experience of extreme weather events and interpretation of temperature anomalies. Polarization around climate and the environment has grown since the 1980s. Some of these differences stem from diverse ideas about the role of government, regulation of the economy, individual responsibility, but they're also a product of deliberate disinformation campaigns and lobbying efforts by powerful corporate interests. This raises the question of how much individual behavior change matters for addressing the Nexus challenges. And while there are intense and differing positions on this that we discussed, there's consensus that organized pressure on decision makers through voting or letter writing or protests are important. The tendency to conform to social norms can entrench unsustainable behaviors, but it can also sustain collective action and be an engine of widespread and rapid social change. And social movements can also resist or drive change. So we spoke a bit about the Yellow Vest movement, which successfully resisted the French government's plan to increase fuel taxes. Even with technologies and policy instruments that allow us in principle to change course, there are social and political barriers, in part because some groups perceive their cultures, identities, and livelihoods to be under threat. So we spoke about this parable, the Council of the Mice, which emphasizes the need to evaluate solutions not only on their potential outcomes, but also on implementation and governance challenges and their likely social and political acceptance or resistance. On who's harmed by policy and who benefits. So the distribution of job gains and losses across the US under the Net Zero America Plan emphasizes the importance of considering the intersectional nature of policies in order to create broad-based and potentially bipartisan support for these policies. So these are some of the social, economic, and political influences on the Nexus.
Oh, I'll give it to you. Let me give it.
All right. Can everyone hear me? Awesome. So we started off class when we were talking about some of the moral reasoning we were going to do. And if you remember way back from the first day of class, we talked about this process of reflective equilibrium. So this idea that we understand reflective equilibrium as the endpoint of some deliberative process. We were going to reflect and revise our beliefs about a particular area of inquiry. In this sense, it was a moral area of inquiry about these various Nexus problems. And so this kind of inquiry that we've been doing is to ask specific moral questions, like what is the right thing to do in a particular case? But we also were asking more general questions in this kind of mode of inquiry about whether a particular theory or account of justice or responsibility or right action should be the one that we should accept. And so just to kind of remember and then to take with you what this kind of process that we've been modeling in here could be, is that we might start where we are, right? So this method of reflective equilibrium can consist in working back and forth between our considered judgments, the principles or rules that we think govern them, and also any kind of theoretical considerations that we believe might have something to bear on accepting the certain considered judgments about what we think the right thing to do is in a particular challenge or case. And the idea is to revise any of these elements where we see it necessary to achieve some sort of acceptable coherence between our beliefs and our understandings about what we ought to do. So you might have come into this class with a certain set of commitments or normative beliefs, or maybe weren't aware that these were certain questions that should be asked. So what we put on the table is a number of different kinds of debates, but also guiding principles and underlying normative conceptions that can help us think about revising those stated considered judgments. And the idea is that we're reflecting back and forth in a way that would bring out these ethical principles and worldviews, and maybe some of even the moral intuitions that you brought into class about specific cases into alignment with one another. So if you found while you were in class, depending on whatever issues you were focusing on, that some principles were maybe conflicting in your ethical beliefs when looking at particular kinds of cases, that hopefully at least raises the question for you to see whether you have to adjust maybe the principles that you had, underlying coming into those kinds of considered judgments, or whether your intuitions need to be revised, right, in light of new important information and how the principles that you might be committed to come into cohere. So you might see that a method of reflective equilibrium that you've been doing about many of the Nexus problems, that this would be successful when you arrive at some sort of, somewhat coherent set of these kinds of beliefs. And some sort of acceptable coherence requires that your beliefs are not only just consistent with each other, right? That might be understood as like a weak requirement, that you at least have some sort of consistency in your reasoning, but also that these beliefs provide support or provide an explanation for other sets of beliefs you might have about what we ought to do in light of these different problems. But something that I think is important to examine is also not just mere coherence, but this idea that the beliefs and commitments and principles that you might be subscribing to, they are open to revision, right? So to be keeping this kind of aim of doing reflective equilibrium as you go on, both in your studies and in your decision making, when it comes to voting or supporting different kinds of organizations or things that you're going to do that might touch on some of these Nexus issues. So in a practical context, when you emerge out of this class, the hope is that this kind of deliberation could help you to come to some conclusions about what you ought to do, right? And so that kind of normative question has been something that we've been focusing on. But to take a step out of that, I wanted to just kind of cover briefly this idea that, we've talked about a range of things, including what our responsibilities are, who do we mean by we, what is the source of these kinds of obligations. And in doing so, we wanted to reflect on what should these kinds of obligations and the theories that justify them include. Are we just talking about commitments to humans? Should we include non-human animals? Are we looking at obligations to wider things like ecosystems? And how should we weigh also these kinds of judgments against the kinds of interests and obligations we might have, as Professor Pakala said, to generations that might be maybe different than us culturally, or ones that we may never come to know? And should we understand the duties and the obligations we have as restricted to certain kinds of circumstances, or do they extend beyond some of the contexts that problems in certain geographies present? So some of these kinds of considerations, right, have led us to maybe broaden the scope of our moral reasoning. And we were able to kind of take a deep dive in doing this by hopefully examining questions of value and how that's inserted in our thinking about certain commitments. And we talked at the very beginning about intrinsic and instrumental values, why we might want to, let's say, preserve ecosystem health. Do we think that there's something inherently valuable with that, or does it serve some sort of instrumental value? But another kind of value that I just want to highlight in this kind of overview is that we did talk a lot about also relational approaches to ethics and relational values that we might have. So these play an important role in reframing some of the environmental and climate issues. And it offers kind of alternatives, right, to maybe some consequentialist or cost-benefit approaches that Professor Constantino just talked about, and not necessarily focus on just outcomes, but also look at the underlying relationships and structures that we have. So this came up, and these kinds of considerations also run up against the challenge, of course, of time, the time to do things, right, in light of wanting to hit these targets. So there's maybe a potential tension here, right, that we discussed. But a broader kind of theme in this sense of focusing on relational ethics suggests that the environmental problems that we've been examining in the Nexus can't be addressed without attention to relations. And what are these good relations? And what's going to require them to be revised and continue to work? And this requires us to bring in a range of justice considerations, not merely just how we should maybe equally distribute resources, but also to take into consideration different kinds of forms of oppression and underlying power structures that might be at play, right, in our considerations about justice. So we want to be able to do these kinds of changes, and when we're starting to look at the kinds of actions that we're required to do, one thing that I hope that you took from some of the readings that we did was to find out, well, are we hitting certain kinds of targets in which inclusivity, transparency, and also certain decolonial commitments have at least been considered, and what would those look like? So in examining different forms of oppression and domination, how those kinds of things play out, those entanglements play out with our relationships to the non-human world, and again, to these kinds of larger systems. So that required us to look at conceptions of race and gender and disability and connections with climate colonialism when we were discussing those issues. But what I wanted to end with in the last couple minutes that I get to address all of you is that I've had a number of individual conversations with a number of you coming up to me after class and being like, man, these problems are overwhelming. I'm constantly anxious, and then I leave class and I don't know what to think about it, right? There's a considerable amount of optimism that we have maybe in our technological capabilities, but certain kinds of anxiety or pessimism about the capabilities of our politics to be able to kind of work within these kinds of timeframes. So I just wanted to address your climate anxiety a little bit and see if I can offer resources that I draw from that maybe can be available to you as you leave beyond this class. And that's that these ideas of you maybe having certain kinds of feelings and moving between maybe some forms of despair and then maybe some sort of optimism is that it's totally rational, right, for you to have some kinds of considerations and worries. And that is absolutely an appropriate response. We would think that something would be wrong with that. But to be wary about the kind of overwhelming doomism that's often peddled, right? Because these are obviously ways to kind of divert you from action. So where you might want to hold on to is a sense of gritty hope or a sense of active hope, where the kinds of work that you're doing and engaging in communities on different levels of engagement can be a source for you to find points in which you're also able to cultivate resilience amongst those communities and also be able to inspire, right, yourself about doing things in a way that's active and not merely passive and hoping folks are gonna, find the solutions for us. So if you want extra readings on that sort of sentiment, I'm always happy to give that to you. But I wanted to thank you all for at least coming in here and facing these tough challenges. So I'll turn it over to Professor Nixon.
Great, so that's an excellent segue into the arts and literature section. As I mentioned at the outset of the course, there's been no social movement ever that has not had stories and images as an integral part of its communicative endeavor. And so you're super smart, well-educated. Not everybody you're communicating will be in that position. And so one of the things that we're constantly negotiating as artists and writers is how to get across with an informed emotional impact stories information in a story form that a broader audience can engage with. And so creating these kind of imaginative alliances, these bridges between constituencies, is something that artists can really contribute to any large environmental and social challenge. So if we go back to the movement for emancipation of enslaved people. We go back to suffragette movement, the HIV/AIDS crisis and ACT UP, or the Marriage Equality Act, the end of apartheid. All of these movements, artists and storytellers were a very active part of the overall impetus for change. Okay, so I just, in a compressed form, I just wanted to allude to a couple of different images and statements from this sector of the course. One of them was in the section on the Anthropocene. We are the asteroid here. The biologist Anthony Bonoski is trying to get across a difficult idea, the idea that Homo sapiens has a biogeochemical impact on all the planet's essential life systems, okay? And then we talked, in light of what Sarah was saying, about how we communicate this very dramatic impact between humanity and the planet. And then we try to disaggregate that and look at unequal impacts and the questions of social and environmental injustice, which we talked about in this sector of the course as well. So as with that last image, here in the work of Jason DeCaris Taylor, the artist is dealing with these very difficult issues of translating massive scales, temporal and physical scales, into emotional impacts, okay? And so we talked a little bit about how the effect of the scuba divers on the surface, the illuminated scuba divers, the effect of that is to create a sense not just of the distance between them and the sculptor in physical terms, but in temporal terms as well. The idea that he uses these figures to create a kind of anticipatory retrospective view on our present, so that they're almost these sort of otherworldly angelic figures looking back on our carbon-intensive age. Ta-Nehisi Coates, you might recall, says this: racism is a visceral experience that dislodges brains, blocks airways, rips muscle, extracts organs, cracks bones, breaks teeth. You must never look away from this. You must always remember that the sociology, the history, the economics, the graphs, the charts, the regressions all land with great violence upon the body. So this is another dimension to the way that artists and writers engage with data. And even in the first sentence there, the way that Ta-Nehisi Coates uses verb after verb after verb, dislodge, block, rips, extract, cracks, breaks. There's a deep physicality to the writing there that is essential to communicating the sense of these essential models of economic data, environmental data more broadly, how they can impact the physical system of the individual. And as we know, emotions are very much related to physiology. Emotions are always embodied. The final image I just wanted to flag is this image of Wangari Maathai. Both in this lecture and in the lecture on COVID, climate, and Black Lives Matter, what I was trying to communicate is the value of intersectional approaches. So on the surface, the Greenbelt movement was about tree planting, but it was also about creating a gateway into a sense of civic agency for marginalized and embattled rural women. And so it's an environmental struggle that she is leading here, but it's also a broader struggle under an authoritarian system to create a sense of civic agency, self-worth, and from that, the capacity to build social alliances that are not environmental in character, but can be aligned with the desires for a more equitable society and transformations in the distribution of access to life's resources. So I'll leave it there so we have a couple of minutes for questions. I think, yeah. Oh, yes, that would be useful.
I just want to end by saying two things. The first is that although I swore never to tell you how you should think about these problems, I do want to say one thing, and that is it is all too easy to succumb to cynicism and despair. And as a human, and as a parent, and as a professor, I think your responsibility as a gifted person is not to allow yourself to succumb to cynicism and despair. It's intellectually lazy to do so, so just try never to do it. The second thing I'd like to say is that I want to thank you all, so many of you, for being engaged and curious and polite and respectful despite the sort of physical difficulties of doing this with this on and off COVID thing that we've had going. Please understand that although this may be due to your wonderful qualities, you got that way with help. Everyone got help to get the way they are, if they're that way. And so from me, as a professor and a parent, find the person who helped you and thank them over the holidays, because we're all the beneficiaries of that. Are there any questions that any of you have before we break up? All right, well then we'll see you in the review.